Welcome to the Flare Build Podcast. Today's guest is Billy Irwin from Robinhood. Billy has been running the OS team at Robinhood for the last 4.5 years. He founded the iOS platform team 2 years ago and now runs the full mobile platform. Billy has been driving all aspects of the modernization timeline, including CI improvements, testing of platforms, and now the complete implementation of Bazel. Now, over to your hosts, Zach and Tatiana, the co-founders of Flare Build, the first consultancy product-based company focused on Bazel.
So in today's conversation, we are talking with Billy Irwin about Robinhood's journey with developer tooling that inevitably led them to Bazel. But before we dive into that conversation, actually, Billy and I wanted to give just a quick intro to frame the conversation in a way that might be useful. And I think this is interesting because, and I'll let Billy, of course, jump in here, but I think that Robinhood's mobile journey to Bazel was not super straightforward in that it wasn't something that was an obvious need up front. And so I'll basically hand it over to Billy at this point to frame it. But I just think that this could be a useful conversation for folks that are a little bit more hesitant or skeptical around Bazel. And I know that, there's a lot of movement these days with organizational changes that are sort of forcing different tooling onto development teams who, rightfully so in a lot of cases are somewhat skeptical. So I just want to make sure we emphasize that part of the journey here before we dive into the convo. So I'll hand it over to Billy to sort of maybe set up the framing.
Awesome. Well, first, thank you for having me on. I guess kind of looking at it, it took us probably about a year or two since I think, Bazel was kind of always on the back of our mind, but I'd say actually took about 2 years before I say we were finally ready to take the plunge and actually move our build system from Xcode build over to Bazel. I think there's a lot of factors that we've thought about throughout the years, but I think ultimately it really just always came down to two things for us. The main one was, as I think most platform type teams need to always be thinking, is this the biggest problem to solve right now? Certainly, even 2 years ago, we were a large iOS code base. Compile times were certainly not, I would say, super fast. But I think we even then had more issues we needed to deal with, especially as we were a fast-growing iOS team. We really wanted to make sure that we had the right infrastructure in place, that we could keep scaling engineers, that we could build things in a safe and performant manner. And I think that at the time, that being able to scale the code base just to more engineers and not be shipping bugs, I think was our number one priority. I think the second is part of it was the unknowns of moving to Bazel. It's certainly scary to move your tool chain over to something that, isn't first party support by Apple. But, I think the other is one of the common things we've heard is migrating to Bazel is just the beginning. We no longer have teams at Apple that are really supporting us, right? Like we're kind of supporting ourselves. And I think really making sure that we had the foundations in place at Robinhood, we can do the migration and we're confident we can do it in a good way. But also having the foundations in place that, as we're owning and maintaining this over the years, that we actually have teams kind of around this. And I think those were always the two biggest things. I think basically the main thing that's changed in the last 2 years is one, our build times have certainly become the number one developer problem, especially for iOS engineers. And two, I think as a company, we've just become a bit more mature and we're able to actually build and form teams around this.
Right. It makes sense. So early on, you saw the adoption of Bazel and probably other teams struggling with it heavily within Robinhood. And of course, that's plenty of cause for hesitancy, seeing just some of the pain that comes along with it. And then at the same time, you had other problems to solve. But over the intervening year or two, hopefully you saw the other teams at Robinhood start to have more success with Bazel, as well as yourselves sort of able to ramp up a platform team and do some of the other prep work. Of course, get through all the other more important issues before build times became the biggest priority. Great. Yeah. So I'm curious if there were any other factors, like maybe externally and like the improved community or anything like that also helped you make this decision.
Yeah. I think definitely one of the first things I think we did as we really started thinking more about, is it time to move to Bazel, was just talking to members of the community. And I think that alone eased a lot of our concerns, realizing that one, a lot of the problems that we anticipated we might run into are kind of already almost solved problems within the Apple and Swift rule sets. as well as just we have a community to work with, right? We're not the only people going through this journey, and that there is a really, really awesome iOS community out there where, I think a lot of people want to see Bazel becoming more of a, easy to use option for iOS development, especially at companies at scale. So knowing that we'd have a lot more people support was super, super helpful for us. I think also it's probably worth mentioning that I think we always knew Bazel was always a matter of when, not if. I think that's always just the tricky thing is you could probably even make the argument that maybe we waited a little bit too long. Certainly our build times today are not great. I think especially the last few months, we're really happy we started a few months ago. We're not starting today. Maybe we could have started 3 months or 6 months earlier and things would be in a better place. But I think most things are either you do it too early or too late. I think it's just trying to narrow how early or how late you are is really the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as listeners will find in the upcoming conversation, it sounds like things have gone pretty smooth. So yeah, from a planning and execution perspective, it sounds like you made pretty much most of the right choices. And it sounds like build times aren't great, before Bazel has rolled out here, but it's not a total disaster either. So yeah, it sounds like all in all, pretty well executed. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up our little intro segment here and get on to the real conversation. Billy, welcome to the Bazel Show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, right on. So today we're talking about the journey that has brought you to a point over at Robinhood where you are midway into adopting Bazel. And so contrary to a lot of our other conversations, which are typically taking place fairly close to the end of this journey, you are just getting started. And so I think this is an interesting point in time for us to sync up on all this stuff. So obviously the focus for this conversation is going to be more around really motivation and the decision to get into Bazel. So we can really, I think, drill in there a little bit deeper than we do in our other conversations because we don't have to focus on all the implementation details quite so much. So yeah, with that, I think maybe I'll hand it over to you to sort of paint a picture of the backstory of what brought you to this point.
Yeah. So maybe just to give everyone a little deep dive into maybe just who I am and maybe a little bit of background. So I've been an iOS engineer at Robinhood for about 4.5 years. Joined when we were pretty small, so I was about the second or third full-time iOS engineer. Our code base was actually about 4 years old when I joined. I think like most startups, the iOS app kind of had a wide range of people working on it in the early days, but kind of I was probably one of the second or third full-time hires to actually just work on the app. Over the last 4.5 years, we've scaled the team to we're just about 50 iOS engineers now, pushing probably about 2 to 2.5 million lines of code. And, for the last 2 years or so, I kind of have broken off from product development and really been founding a lot of our more platform teams. And, one of my main focuses has just been keeping the iOS engineers as productive as possible. So, this journey started about 2 years ago. I think at that time, we were probably around 20 iOS engineers. And I think at that point, it was just becoming pretty clear that having a few people part-time, maintaining our infra, our build tools, our CI was just not a viable option anymore. And we kind of need someone to really think about it much more full-time. I'd say the classic story of what the biggest battle we've had the last 2 years is build times. I think most large iOS shops that kind of get to our size quickly realize how big of a problem this can be for developer productivity. So, I think even 2 years ago, Bazel was obviously, I think at that point, starting to gain a bit more, widespread adoption within the large iOS shops. And it's actually even Robinhood itself was really starting to explore Bazel for a lot of our like backend and data systems, especially for, we're a big Python and Go shop. So at that point, Bazel's the path to migrating Python and Go to Bazel is pretty like well defined. Personally, I was a little hesitant at the time to move to Bazel, mostly because I've heard not horror stories, but I've heard how hands-on not only the migration is, but kind of what the long-term maintenance. It's like every time Apple releases a new version of Xcode, it's like, all right, well, things are going to break because, a lot of the Bazel stuff is just kind of guessing where Xcode wants to see a file placed. So I think at that time, I'd say our build times were a problem, but I felt like ripping the Band-Aid off at that time to moving to Bazel may have been almost overkill for how large the problem was at the time. And there's probably other things we could do for a while to kind of keep build times at a manageable level. But I definitely would say probably starting about 5 to 6 months ago, it was starting to become really clear that there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit left. I think we were prepared to start making more drastic changes, and Bazel seemed like the obvious path forward.
Yeah, totally understandable. Before you decided that Bazel was really the only way out, can you run me through some of the other items that your team worked on sort of before you got there?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to say this was like a grand vision, but I think one thing that we did really early that helped a lot was we pretty early adopted using Xcode for our project. Actually, like classic small startup. I think someone at one point just like slacked it, being like, "Oh, this looks cool," and then randomly we come in next Monday, and one of our engineers had just done it and just moved our whole project over to it. And I think we started it for the obvious reason, which was even when we were like only 4 or 5 engineers dealing with Xcode projects was already becoming a huge hassle for us. And I think every iOS team that has more than 3 or 4 people, you start to get really good at how to rebase and deal with merge conflicts. And I think it seemed easy enough for us to move. And I think the real value that we ended up seeing was when you just have simple ways to kind of codify your project structure. It became really, really easy to just build our own tooling. It wasn't, we moved to Xcode Proj and then we realized like, wow, it's maybe half a day of work to write a Python script that we can just generate new modules whenever we need to. And I think that kind of unlocked, I'd say, what was our real first stage of modularization of our code base. When we realized, it's really, really easy now for us to, when I joined, we kind of had the original mono target of like, it was just the Robinhood app and all of our code was in one target. Then we kind of started this, really, I'd say it was like a 2-year long journey of this was probably our first step of dealing with compile times, was just slowly modularizing the app. I think we started with, probably your classic utils module, your UI module. And I think that just grew and grew and grew over time. And probably the really first project I did when I took on this new role as more of a platform engineer was, I think we had gotten a really good place that when you're adding new code, we were really good about putting it in new modules. But, we still had this monolithic 3,000 file, probably pushing a few 100,000 lines of code, Robinhood target. And at the end of the day, everything has to compile before it. And then you have this huge chunk that's taking 2 to 3, sometimes even like 4 to 5 minutes, depending on, the CPU of your computer. So that was actually really the first thing I did was figure out how do we actually break this up? I think we were able to break it up into almost 30 or 40 different modules. And right off the bat, I think that unlocked 2 things. One, our compile times already. We were able to utilize the CPUs and multiple cores on our machines way more to actually parallelize our compilation. The other thing is we started adopting this idea of, we called them playgrounds. This was actually before Swift playgrounds became a thing. So we never actually changed the name, but, really became overloaded. Yeah. I think most computer programming terms these days get overloaded really fast. But, really the whole idea of it was we kind of just made a really, really lightweight stripped down base version of the actual app. And the idea was you could just embed any vertical feature in it. So, really one of the ways we thought about where modular our code base, we kind of had 2 ways to think about it. One was kind of the more upstream, I'd say like horizontal layers. You have your utils, your models, your core UI, your analytics, things that are just used kind of universally across all your features. But then we really tried to then take the large chunks of actual product code and really vertically segment it. So, for Robinhood, for instance, we might have an equities trading target. We might have an options trading target. We'll have a ACH target, for like transferring money in and out. We'll have a login target, just really trying to think vertically. And then what we did is we made it that you could embed any of those more vertical features kind of in a maybe like slightly stripped down, but just with the really underlying infra you actually needed for each feature. And really the name of the game was get developers to compile the least amount of code possible. Right. And I think that was something we've iterated a lot on over the years. We then realized that another really big developer woe we started realizing is when you just open up the Xcode project, developers' computers would just freeze for 30 seconds because, we're loading so much code. This is actually, I've now learned that a lot of companies do this. I think most call it a focused project. Yep. But we eventually got to the point that even with Xcode Gen, it was really, really easy to build tooling on top of that. that you could say, hey, I just want to run the, equities trading feature. And we would really be able to, with just a few lines of code, traverse your entire dependency tree and just say, oh, well, we only actually need to load this code into Xcode even in the first place. And I think that we kind of just kept iterating a little bit on like these types of small things, really just trying to think about how can we split up your code as much as possible so that you're depending on the least amount of code possible, and we can try to utilize your cores as much as possible for parallelization and just load the least amount of code possible as ever we need into Xcode. So that was the main thing we did, I'd say, for local development. On CI, at the time I kind of took over our CI, we were actually still using Circle CI. And I think the obvious thing we did then was just get off of VMs, and we actually moved to bare metal, which was really good timing because right around when I wanted to make this decision, Amazon announces that they now support Macs. Mm-hmm. And so obviously our security team was thrilled that we could actually have our CI machines in the same VPC as the rest of Robinhood. So it didn't take a lot of convincing for us to say, why don't we give this a shot? So we moved basically to bare metal machines. I think at that time, so this was almost 2 years ago, our CI times were pushing about 30 minutes to actually build and run all of our tests. We actually went almost immediately down to 12 minutes, just moving to like the AWS bare metal machines. So that was just, obviously it took a little bit of work to kind of go to self-managed machines, and we have to, maintain our own images. And there's obviously extra costs on top of that versus just, Circle CI, you just have a YAML file in your code base and everything just kind of magically works. But the immediate gains were fantastic.
So that's great overview. So definitely want to drill in a bit on some of that stuff. So it sounds like you did a lot of the work getting the developer experience really nailed down before throwing Bazel into the mix, which I like. A lot of times the Bazel efforts might also coincide pretty heavily with some of the other items as well, which of course makes the transition a little bit more of a challenge. But in particular, the Xcode Gen work that you did super early on, that's obviously lays the groundwork for moving to Bazel, I think, in a way that is sort of easier than coming from other tools per se, because you've already got a structured, sort of clearly defined set of schema defining your build. So I definitely want to talk about how that sets you up for success. Before we move on, though, I think definitely also I want to touch a little bit on the focused projects, like sort of playground stuff. So you said initially the playgrounds were really more about, I guess at runtime, just easily grouping together, just the set of targets to run them. I guess I'm kind of curious, I know there was probably some work, even just getting all that to work with switching probably like your linking mode and stuff like that. That's a common theme. And I want to drill in a little bit there. Like, what were your startup times like? And before you moving over to Bazel, did you make a big change of moving from dynamic to static linking, like a lot of folks tend to do when they become worried about startup times at scale? Or is that something that you've done a deep dive into?
A little bit. We've been pretty good about measuring cold start time for the last year or two. And I guess not shockingly, but the metrics actually always been pretty good for us. So kind of said earlier, we kind of thought about modularization in two ways. When we first started doing it, we made basically all those vertical features. Those were actually always static. So we always made those static libs, but a lot of our horizontal ones were dynamic. So I think that helped with our cold start, at least in the beginning, because we had maybe 30 to 40 dynamically linked, but then maybe another 40 statically linked. So I think that helped a bit. At the moment, we're only really in the US, so we haven't been super worried about bundle size. So, I think that's been kind of a nice thing to fall back on, that we could statically link a lot of things and not really worry about overloading the bundle. We actually did recently, before we started the Bazel migration, because we had actually heard from a lot of people in the industry that moving everything to statically link will actually help a lot with the Bazel migration. So we had kind of decided to make that change and just measure to see what happened. Obviously we did get a nice little decrease in our cold start time. It actually wasn't super significant. It was more like 10 to 20%, which, given that it wasn't super long, it was only 1 or 2 seconds to start. We didn't really see any noticeable improvements, but it's so nice to always have. And then, we didn't have too much of a bundle size increase either. So luckily that all kind of just worked for us pretty well. Some of that maybe we lucked into a little bit. The other just kind of happened.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And so other than the build times, were there any other limits you felt like you were starting to hit with Xcode Gen and the various project and build tooling at that point?
Yeah, I think something you kind of hinted on, we've always tried to keep our Xcode gen, so Xcode gen has this whole idea of a template. And you can kind of, so basically for our different type of modules, we had different predefined templates. And then, defining a module is almost just like filling out the fields in the template. We definitely did start to find that I'd say templates feel a little bit more like object-oriented programming in some way, where it almost feels like you're just continuously subclassing. And I think as our project really scaled and, we started having more and more developers, and it starts to get a little bit harder to almost control what everyone's doing. And, people might go and start doing more like one-off and ad hoc things to kind of cover their use case. It definitely started becoming a bit more of a nightmare to maintain all the templates to kind of keep everything working. Or when you needed to make larger changes, it could kind of start to become a nightmare. So I think that was certainly one thing that's become a bit of, I think from our side of things, as we're trying to kind of keep our code base like clean, as idiomatic as possible, that definitely started to become a bit of a developer burden for us. But I think, I do ultimately think build times was the defining factor in when we were like, all right, it's really time to start considering Bazel.
Great. So you adopted faster CI solution on bare metal that got you down to 12 minutes for your end-to-end test times, I guess, too. Is that the number?
Yeah, pretty much. Although I will admit that was a very short-lived number.
Right. That's exactly what I want to ask. How long did that last? And just maybe walk us through like what that looked like. Because I think that probably the move to metal coincided with a big growth phase probably for Robinhood, right? So I guess those times probably exploded pretty quick, huh?
Yeah, so probably the last year and a half, we've gone from about 20 to 22 engineers to about 50. And I think, so I got our CI times down to about 12 minutes. I think it took us about another year to get back to 20, which I thought was acceptable. I think in my head, I've always kind of kept the magic number 30 as, I'd love to stay under 30, but I think 30 is, it's not great, but I don't think it's going to hold productivity. If, if we're under 30, there's probably more impactful things that, I could always be working on. But then we noticed a trend so it took about a year or 6 months to go up 8 minutes. Then it took us 2 months to go up the next 8 minutes.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. It's to be expected. You don't really think about it, but then, you kind of just start doing a little, diving deep into your Git history, and you realize that, we were literally hitting almost exponential curve in commits to the repo. If I would say like, all right, I'm going to go back 1,000 commits, that gets me back 2 months. Like, all right, I'll go back another 1,000 commits. Well, now I'm going back 8 months and another 1,000 commits. And I think that was kind of an eye-opening thing to me when I really realized that when I joined the code base with about 100,000 lines of code, it probably took us another year to get 250,000 lines of code. And the next thing you know, a year later, we're at 1 million lines of code. And then a year later, we're at 2 million lines of code. And you're like, all right, well, this is clearly going up. And I think that's for a lot of reasons. One is certainly just adding more and more people to contributing to the code base. I think another thing that we didn't think about as much is, I think as you build out more sophisticated infrastructure in your code base itself, it tends to actually just be more code. Even if you think about the classic MVC to either MVVM, or we kind of have this hybrid MVVM Viper model that we kind of came up with a few years ago, but you start even thinking about to do the same thing, you just have more code, which isn't bad. It's better separation of concerns. I think it's much easier to navigate a large code base sometimes when, even if there's more code, it's more clear what everything in the code base is doing. All this kind of adds up. And it was about 4 or 5 months ago when, at this point, we've hired a few extra engineers. We're actually looking more like a team in the platform org rather than, at least on iOS, just me. And we're kind of looking at some dashboards, and I think we're starting to have a lot more candid discussions about, I think like the first thing we always tried to say was, is there something we could do other than Bazel? Right. I think that's kind of always the starting point whenever we have these type of conversations we want to start at, mostly because, we just know that Bazel is going to be a large migration. We're going to have to make sure we have a team around it to maintain and upkeep it. And I think we've always known it's where we're going to end up. I think it was always just a question of when we were there. But I think that was really when we saw that radical increase in CI time, when we're like, wow, we don't really have an answer for this one. I think for the last year or two, we always kind of had some extra little thing to look into that we'd be able to cut off a minute or two or kind of delay the growth. I think this was the first time where we're really just like, wow, there's probably nothing we can do with this one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. We talk a lot about some of the motivations for Bazel sort of across the industry. And yeah, like there's actually a white paper out of Google that talks about how, definitely at Google, and the same is true probably at a lot of other companies, the amount of compute time or resources it takes to build a project is just the quadratic function of the number of lines of code and the head count of engineers. So yeah, you're basically always looking at this exponential growth of whether it's times or if you can run the things in parallel, the cost of running that test suite. And unfortunately, especially with iOS, we've got these monolithic app targets that are, in the end, they need to be linked and then tested. So there's always going to be a bottleneck in the graph, even if you do find a little bit of parallelization there, right? So
always have bottlenecks.
Yeah. Of course, the thing about Bazel that allows it to change that math is, of course, the caching. And, parallel execution remotely is also great, but it's really about caching those components that you've already done all that work of splitting up all the targets. And this allows us, of course, to more effectively cache it and have some avoidance of both builds and tests there. That's what changes that growth curve. Great. So at this point, CI times are just going up by 8-10 minutes a month. It looks like, you could see the trend, I'm sure. I think the choice starts to make a little bit more sense. So you mentioned you knew up front that, it's going to be a decent amount of effort. You're going to need a team to sort of maintain it. I guess I'm kind of curious, like, what did it look like getting the rest of the developers on board? Because this is going to change like their day to day to some extent as well, right? Because now application engineers are going to need to interface with the build graph a little bit, whether through build files or whatever. So I guess, how did you sell this to the team?
Yeah, great question. Shockingly, it was incredibly easy to sell this to the team. I was like, I think this is going to make local build times way faster. And everyone's like, go, please do this. Mm-hmm. I think part of it was, I think most of our engineers are already pretty comfortable with editing, because most own their Xcode Gen YAML files. And like, even though we've kind of made a lot of templates and made it easy as possible, I think the idea of owning your project setup being in a config file, I think everyone was already pretty comfortable with. Most engineers who joined Robinhood, it's just always been there. So it's always just been kind of, part of their day-to-day flows. I think the biggest thing that we always try to do with these types of stuff is just set expectations. The first thing we told everyone was, we're going to move to Bazel. We can't even tell you how long this is going to take right now. Actually, the very first thing myself and another iOS engineer did is we just told everyone we're going to take 2 or 3 weeks and we're just going to go experiment. And, I'm just going to start with a Hello World app, right? And actually do it. At this point, I've done some stuff with Bazel in other parts of the Robinhood code bases, mostly with Python and Go. So I at least understood the bare basics of how Bazel works and operates. I think, just how that translates to iOS development was what I wanted to get a better kind of grasp on. I think from all perspectives, it wasn't much of a hard sell at this point. I think for most of the iOS developers, all I had to do was say, this might radically speed up build times. And everyone was on board. For a lot of leadership at the company, I think Robinhood as an end-org has already moving in this Bazel direction. So I think the idea of just even getting iOS more in line with the greater Robinhood engineering ecosystem was already like a big sell. One thing that we didn't have to think about was our remote cache, because we already had a remote cache at Robinhood set up. So we were just going to leverage that. So yeah, shockingly easy sell. This was one of the rare times when, I think one of the hardest things about being kind of on the platform side is really trying to figure out what is the most impactful thing to work on. And I think this is one of those rare times where it was just so obvious what to do that, I didn't even have to spend, weeks to months drafting proposals and roadmaps. I was like, we're just going to move to Bazel and get our remote build cache. And everyone's like, go for it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. And so before we dive in super deep into, what the transition and planning and stuff looks like for that, I actually want to drill in a little bit deeper on another thing that you're probably aware of is a little bit of a gotcha in Bazel iOS, and that is mixed source modules where you've mixed Objective-C and Swift. So this comes up inevitably in every conversation that we have about iOS and Bazel because it's sort of one of those rough edges. So maybe tell me a little bit about the state of Objective-C within the Robinhood app during this timeline that we've talked through so far.
Yeah. So when I joined, I think our code was about 50-50, Objective-C, Swift. And then, obviously for like 2 or 3 years, we pretty much didn't add any Objective-C to the code base. So, even just by natural code growth and small refactors here and there, I think About a year ago, we were about 90% Swift and 10% Objective-C. Semi because I knew we were going to move to Bazel at some point, and semi because I'd heard enough developers complain about Objective-C. Actually, it's one thing that's crazy. Like when I started, I've been doing iOS for almost 10 years. I did Objective-C for, probably 6 years primarily. And now realizing that half the iOS engineers on our team had never even written a line of Objective-C before joining Robinhood. We tried last year kind of doing, a more community driven effort around just getting rid of Objective-C in our code base. I think these types of efforts are certainly always interesting because, even though we have 35, 40 iOS engineers at the time, most of the engineers are on their own vertical product team with their own roadmap and priorities. I think this is always an interesting experiment at companies of how do you kind of get this horizontal community to kind of achieve, a code base wide effort, even though everyone's got their own teams, their own roadmaps. But, luckily, one of our engineers did a really, really good job putting together a plan of how to go about this, how to, kind of make tasks super chunk sized and achievable. And actually, by the time we started the Bazel migration, we only had like 20 Objective-C files left in the code base. So I did actually, before we did anything, I did at least move all the Objective-C files to their own module. Basically, everyone was like, if you can do it, just take a week or two and get rid of, at least separate Objective-C and Swift. So I followed that advice. And very happy I did because it was not actually that much work to do that, and can tell how much work it would have been the other way around.
Yeah, and it's just slower with or without Bazel, right? Because you've got sort of compiler within compiler inception going on, and it's just slower. So yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I think that's a luxury of being a newer company, right? Like a lot of folks with a lot more Objective-C, they're stuck with it for better or worse. And yeah, it's pretty awesome to just sort of over time, like kind of moved away from it. And I share I think your length of, employment in the iOS community for sure. And so, it's wild to see like the newer devs just, they don't touch Objective-C. The thing really came and went, man, I guess. But nowadays it's definitely interesting. All right. Well, so I think at this point we've laid the groundwork pretty well. I think we understand sort of where you're coming from, what your motivations were. Like you said, you've exhausted most of the low-hanging fruit at this point. I think any of the other optimizations you might be looking at would be probably a lot more additional technical complexity. But then at the end of the day, like you're still sort of stuck with the standard tooling, the standard build tools. And maybe if you could start moving away from some of those, move to some different linkers or something like that. But then you're really pushing it because you're sort of like hacking into, the tool chain without really like a clearly defined way of doing that. Right. So that's obviously what tools like Bazel offer is sort of an idiomatic way to start doing more advanced things and managing your tool chains, manually and stuff. But short of going there, I feel like you're getting into even more dangerous territory if you just start trying to make other like sort of hand-tuned manual optimizations that it just becomes really brittle. So it makes sense you didn't really go super deep there. So other than Bazel, I'm curious, did you look at any of the other alternative tools? So obviously Buck, in years past at least, is definitely something that, the iOS community has gotten some value out of. Is that something that was ever evaluated or on your roadmap at all?
Not to the point that we actually tried to build any MVPs or anything like that. I think obviously the scariest part about this type of migration is you're kind of decoupling yourself from Apple, and which is definitely the scariest part, right? And I think really what we just did is we just talked to, like we're not really solving a new problem. There's so many people, so many companies and teams before us that have had to go through the same experience. So we really just said, let's just talk to them. And, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I don't even think we need to reinvent the research. Like if other people have kind of evaluated both, I think we can trust each other and go with their approach. It just seems like Bazel's been the clear winner, especially the last 2 or 3 years. Even if you just look at the rule sets for like Rules Apple and Rules Swift, like commits to them every single day. They're super well maintained. I'm super fortunate that both through close friends from college and actually through someone who joined Robinhood within the last year, I've been able to talk with Keith a lot, who I know has been on this podcast before. He's kind of the official maintainer of Rules Apple and Rules Swift. So I really just had a lot of chats with him. I was like, what should we do? And it just seemed like Bazel is the pretty clear path. So we didn't do too much exploration into other things.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, given the point in time at which you started looking into this, I think it makes sense. Buck was, I think, seen as more of a viable competitor maybe a couple of years back when Bazel was really lacking a lot of its iOS support. And yeah, all that great work that the community has done the last few years has, I think, really made a big difference. Yeah, so at this point, I guess we can dive into, like what the transition over to Bazel has looked like so far. So picking up where we left off on the timeline, you see that continued exponential growth of CI times. You decide to, okay, we're prototyping this out, build some Hello World apps, you get an understanding of, what the tooling looks like. Maybe take us from there, what were your next steps in terms of actually, planning and executing?
So the good news is I'd say our code base was pretty primed to do this type of migration. We're already using Xcogen with pretty as well structured templates as we can. Most of our modules are pretty idiomatic. There's they all kind of follow the same pattern. I did spend 1 or 2 weeks in the very beginning getting all the Objective-C into their own targets. So I feel like we're in a really good place to go. The first thing we really did actually is I actually wrote some scripts to basically take all of our Xcogen YAML files and spit out build files and just kind of see what happened. And, super fortunately, a lot of our modules just kind of worked. I could build them. I could run all the tests. Things were actually going super well. So we actually pretty quickly in almost 1 or 2 weeks, we had almost most of our, I'd say we call them our core libraries fully running, building and testing with Bazel. So that was kind of the first step. Then obviously we start hitting some snags because even though we had moved Objective-C out of the code base, you definitely start running into some issues even when you have to mix Obj-C libraries and Swift libraries. We had a lot of fun with header maps and figuring out how to make sure all the right things were included with the Bazel pass. We did have to start doing some things around Objective-C imports and header files. And, if you're compiling with Bazel, we would say use this path. If not, use kind of the standard framework header. But I think that was our first goal is can we basically get all of our library targets to just build, compile, and test. And then once kind of we got there, then we kind of said, all right, let's move on to all the feature stuff. And, really what we were doing is, we were almost taking every template we had with Xcogen and we turned that into a macro. And I think we kind of just started working down the tree. I had this big spreadsheet with every single module being does it compile? Does it run tests? And, we kind of just started, we were trying to get to a point where we could almost divvy up and conquer. And once we kind of got a good handle on that, the next thing we wanted to do was try to get something working as end to end as possible. Basically we knew going into this, the hardest part, libraries up and running. We're all right, we'll be able to get this to work on CI, right? CI is just you basically run some command line tools, get the tests, parse the results, upload, So we kind of punted that for a little bit. My strategy with a lot of this stuff has always been whenever we do these type of migrations, try to tackle the hardest thing as early as possible because that's where all the hiccups are going to be and you might as well figure it out. So we kind of wanted to try something more fully working, but on maybe a slightly smaller scale. So we actually have a Swift CLI tool that, we've been developing in-house. It handles a lot of our scripts for around CI, project generation. You got to name it. It itself has become a pretty large Swiss Army knife over the last 2 years. So we figured this would be a really interesting thing to kind of do full stack, right? Can we get to the point where you're managed deploying? We might even distribute it with the remote build cache, kind of all that stuff. So we kind of started thinking about how that would work. So we started with CI and tried to say, we have this thing has its own set of unit tests for what if we just run these with Bazel first? So we kind of figured out how to do that. Actually, around this time too, we'd been talking to Keith a lot about local development because we're we know this is going to be the hardest part. We had played around with Tulsi and XChammer, which, if just from a Google search seemed like the two most leading open source things for local development. We kind of had issues with both of them. Well, XChammer, we couldn't even get to work out of the box with a Hello World project. And then we kind of have learned that even Pinterest, who came up with it, I don't know if they're fully using it anymore, or at least it seems like it was pretty opinionated to their setup.
Yeah, it's fallen out of date a little bit. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And even Tulsi was working, but we definitely still had some weird hiccups with it. And then basically, we were talking to Keith, and it seems like a lot of companies have kind of gone with you basically generate an Xcogen project from your build files, and then you're essentially just overriding build scripts to then use Bazel underneath the hood, and then you kind of do all this magic voodoo to then move things out of the Bazel artifacts into where Xcode expects them. But then we actually got an intro to Brentley, who, has done a lot of open source Bazel work over the years. And he was actually saying, and he's kind of implemented this now twice. He helped keep build that lift. He did add target. And he's like, I kind of want to do my own open source one. So we were like, we love really early adopters. So we've actually been working with him a lot. We actually have some MVPs of it already working with our code base. So, that was actually a super just kind of fortunate coincidence that this all worked out in parallel. But, when we realized that the Xcode Gen path was kind of going to be also something to work on, this kind of also gave us the idea of, we didn't want to really live in this world of having build files and Xcode Gen YAML files in our code base, especially around, maintenance. So we were like, well, we can probably help out some of this. And we actually decided to, why don't we just write at least the YAML generator, right? We have build files. It's easy to parse them. We can just use the Bazel query CLI to get whatever we need. And probably like one of the first full steps that we fully committed to our repo was we basically got to the point where we could regenerate our entire Xcode project from build files, translate them to YAML files, and then we actually just delete all the YAML files. That was probably the first developer change we did is, we basically told everyone YAML files are gone. We're now going to have build files. Fortunately, I'd say the developer flow, if you need to edit one, it's basically the exact same thing. So, there wasn't much, I wouldn't say there was much of a learning curve, and we kind of walked everyone through what a build file is and what the similarities were. But yeah, that was probably the first big, made something Bazel related load bearing in our code base.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, it's unfortunate that literally I think everyone has written a build file to Xcode or Gen YAML file generator at this point. And I know there's a few folks that have talked about open sourcing it, but there's some hesitance there just because it will quickly become abandonware because it's sort of a stepping stone in a lot of cases, right?
Yeah.
And so, but someone should probably do it just so to save ourselves at least a few weeks every time for every adoption here. I think it's interesting that the timing for you coincided with Brentley's release of a new project generator. I think that another option for folks that sort of works a little bit different than Tulsi out of the box is Rules iOS. And I'm curious if you looked at all at project generator that's in Rules iOS, because it sort of has some of that functionality already as well. Is that something that you evaluated at all?
We did a little bit. We had gotten a little bit of guidance around trying to stay with Rules Swift and Rules Apple as much as possible a little early on from some people in the community in the migration. I think generally our good rule of thumb is the least amount of dependencies is usually a good idea. So I think that was kind of our goal was, just to try to stick with Rules Apple and Rules Swift as much, and then we've definitely had to dip into Rules iOS a little bit here and there, but I think we've generally tried to avoid it. But I think we would have gone a lot deeper into exploring it if it wasn't for kind of, I guess, the chance of our timing kind of working really well with Brentley. Even when I remember Brentley kind of brought it up in some of community chats, it seemed like there was pretty eager, this sounds great, which kind of, I think, was in it itself a bit of a good, okay, maybe everything that exists today isn't that great. So maybe we should just go with the one that everyone seems super excited about.
Yeah.
I think also we have a little bandwidth to be a bit more on the bleeding edge just because, we're nothing is actually developer facing at the moment. So we have a little bit more, we can take some risks and, especially if we think something has a lot of promise. And if, we think there's something that we're going to be able to, in ourselves, influence and kind of help, be part of it from the ground up. And I think having a bit more, understanding actually how it works, I think is a huge thing for all of us, not just using something and magically trusting because, the second something doesn't work, well, now it's going to take me 5 days to debug why this doesn't work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think because you had already done some of that work in demixing, you weren't struck with, we have to go use Rules iOS or write our own rules, right? I think that's kind of, for a lot of the folks in the community, some of the stuff that lives in Rules iOS, they can't really live without it other than committing to writing and maintaining a lot of code because you've just got to deal with those mixed source modules. So I think without that background motivation to even get the build working, having to already have brought in that rule set, I think, you're set up in a good place to think about other things, right? And I share your opinion on avoiding the extra dependencies where possible. Yeah, that's great. So I think another interesting anecdote is just that, we just spoke with another company. That episode will be coming out soon, actually. And they're probably only a few months ahead of you, but just that few months for them was enough. They went the full Rules iOS route and they're pretty stoked about it. So it's funny that the difference a couple months can make on that front. I was going to say, I have a little bit of concern about there's a kind of explosion of options, and I feel like we're fragmenting ourselves a bit much in the community. So I hope we can sort of sort some of that out. But at the same time, like it's super encouraging to see how much interest there is, and like the fact that a lot of folks from a lot of different companies are jumping into like, yeah, just making Bazel for iOS work super great. So yeah, it's exciting to see that. And even Rules iOS, I think that Jerry is putting a lot of additional effort into that project again now. And there's some pretty interesting features there that I actually want to drill in on a little bit. Some of those features, because I think there's a few other items that we actually haven't really gotten to at all yet. So something that we didn't talk about at all, which we probably should have covered earlier, like what is the state of third-party dependencies within Robinhood? What does all that look like sort of before, and what is that going to look like under Bazel?
Yeah, we've definitely had an interesting story around third-party dependencies. We mostly been using Carthage, although obviously we've accumulated enough third-party dependencies over the years that we have a few different ways that we handle third-party dependencies in our code base. I think as much as we can, we just try to use straightforward Carthage, referencing a GitHub repo, with pinned to a version. We have some super legacy parts of our code base that are using code that we've had to just vendor into our code base specifically because there's no support even for Carthage or CocoaPods anymore. We have some third-party dependencies with partners who have closed source code that didn't even support Carthage, so we actually had to clone it, generate the XC frameworks ourselves, and then we self-host them, and then we used Carthage to basically download those. So it certainly has become a lot of different ways to do this over the years. I think this is one of the things that made me super happy with Bazel is it actually simplified all this. Because at the end of the day, everything can just be an HTTP archive. So what that process kind of looked like for us has just been, we basically define our own set of build files for every third-party dependency. So, definitely there's a little bit of an upfront cost that we had to do to define. The good news is that process actually ended up being relatively easy. I think most of our third parties were just either pure Objective-C or pure Swift. So all those were pretty straightforward. We definitely had a few interesting ones that, we might have to define a C library and then embed that C library in the Objective-C library. But, I don't think there's any that took us more than 30 minutes to an hour to get built and compiling. So that's definitely been an interesting thing. Maybe one thing that we need to start thinking about sooner rather than later is what updating a dependency looks like now. But at the moment, you'd have to just go into our workspace file and, just manually update the version, the GitHub URL, all that. Mm-hmm. So we might want to simplify some of that in the future, maybe build more macros to kind of make it that, just say repo version number, and then we handle everything for you. Mm-hmm. But not too worried. I think most companies, updating a dependency is usually a little bit of an effort in itself, just because we need to be super careful. Obviously, we can't just bump our dependency and then discover, a week later that it's causing crashes in production. So, usually most times we bump dependencies, it's usually kind of a ad hoc effort already. But I'm not super worried. It's a little bit harder to bump a dependency in our code base now, but compared to all the other efforts around bumping a dependency, it's pretty, trivial.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I think that's actually some of the motivation for some of the other tooling that's out there also is dealing with CocoaPods, right? Because when you've got a CocoaPods project, you have a lot of assumptions about how that code is going to be built and run. And that's where, again, I think some of course, pod to build in the past, and then some of what Rules iOS also is offering is a solution for CocoaPods based projects. But if you're not on CocoaPods, then a little less motivation there.
Yeah, for sure. I was looking at pods to build, and I kind of had some ideas about, I guess we could write a script to, because most of our dependencies we used did have pod specs in the repo. So maybe I can write a script to, download it and then generate it, basically parse the pod spec, generate the build file, and then we'll just copy it into our repo. But I think some of it is almost like a good exercise to kind of define build files by hand for code bases. And it obviously made us kind of better understand, how C libraries are intermixing with Objective-C libraries. There was some advantage, at least for education purposes, for us to do some of this stuff by hand and kind of just gain the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. They're good little scoped projects to build with Bazel. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess at this point, I'm kind of curious what sort of impacts you have seen so far. I know you're still just sort of starting out, but what data can you share with us?
Yeah, one I'm really excited about. So actually last week, we got building the app and unit testing working on CI. Right now, our build and run unit test step has gotten up to about 45 minutes. And it was about 30 when we started the Bazel effort. So obviously, that increase we were talking about earlier in the podcast, the trend has continued. So basically, we're running all the tests now twice on CI in parallel. And we just make the Bazel ones non-blocking. And we're just notifying my team if those ones fail. And we are seeing times anywhere from 12 minutes to basically around where the job is today, to about like 45 minutes. And, obviously that's pretty much depending just on, what's actually being edited in the change itself.
Right.
So I think our median time is actually sub 20. So the good news is, as we kind of expected, most changes developers are doing are a bit lower in the dependency tree. They're probably on their feature level. So, we're actually not building that much code or not running that many tests. So we're actually hoping in the next week to swap it. We might still run both for another month or two just to, make sure things are working well. But we might actually just make Bazel the blocking one. And we're actually hoping this is going to give everyone like pretty immediately, like 15 to 20 minutes faster CI times just overnight. So that is super, super exciting. And like this is basically no optimization. We just are using, we have a remote build cache, but we're not really tinkering with Bazel anymore, trying to maximize anything. We actually still have a fair amount of bottlenecks in our dependency tree. We actually have someone working on some of the modules right now, kind of in parallel. But probably once we're a bit more further along Bazel, we'll probably put a more concerted effort. And we had a models target that every API model is one of that target. And shocker, that target is edited a lot because you have now 20 different product teams editing their API models all the time. And that basically invalidates our entire build cache.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Because everything depends on it. So we're going to break all those up into probably like 30 models. We're going to do a bunch of those. So basically we're expecting that the median is going to keep even going down as we do all this stuff. So super promising early start. Like this is kind of like the magic of, I think it is pretty rare that you do this migration with these promised results and you basically see them day one. So that has been just the first time like someone actually got running and posted the result. We were all like, all right, we may have made the right decision.
Yeah, that's awesome. So basically 50% or more reduction in the mean P95 or whatever, like kind of right off rip. That's awesome. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I think definitely as you start to refine that a bit more, hopefully, you get those times down even further. Super exciting. Yeah, the target granularity is definitely something to sort of be aware of course. I'm curious. So for your test framework, your tests, do you have a lot of integration tests that depend on the main app target, or have you also done a pretty good job of siloing the test suites to sort of be, again, focused on those vertical modules?
Yeah, we have 3 type of tests we really run today. We kind of have, I'd say like your logic unit tests. And we have, I'd say every target has that type of test target with it. So, we probably have maybe 80 to 100 of those targets kind of sitting around our code base. We recently made a decision to move we've heavily used Snapshot Tests at Robinhood for the last 3 years. And then we actually decided to finally move all Snapshot Tests to their own separate target. So a lot of our mock targets then have 2 test targets. One is for unit tests, pure unit tests. One is for Snapshot Tests. And mostly that's because we use an app host for all of our snapshot tests, because we also do a lot of accessibility stuff with some of our snapshot testing. So you need a test host for those. And then we actually do have a lot of integration tests these days. Actually, what I did before Bazel was kind of this long journey to see if we can make UI testing diff blocking, which I'm super happy to say we did. And we have about 100 UI tests that run on every single PR at Robinhood now, which has been awesome to see, because it's like, the promise of these things are so valuable, but they're so hard to run at scale. Obviously, they're super slow. We do a lot of different sharding. And actually, part of what I'm thinking about now is what does this look like with Bazel? Because right now they're actually on one UI test target. That's all the tests. That will not work for Bazel, because one thing that we need to change is we've always kind of, I think most of our CI infrastructure has always thought of tests as individual tests. Bazel definitely is much more thinks about targets kind of as individual entities. So we're probably going to do a lot of breaking. Luckily, it should be relatively straightforward to take that large UI test target. I mean, we can break it into as many test targets as we want, really. But then we're definitely going to have to do some stuff around thinking about how to leverage the dependency tree and to actually figure out which tests to run. We don't actually have a great answer for that yet, but my hunch is it'll lean somewhere around, we probably can just add artificial depths to a lot of them. So basically we have a bunch of UI tests for like placing an option order. I think it's pretty reasonable to say that we can just make the options target a depth to, even though it's not actually depth to the test runner, we can just say like, all right, well, edit options code, like, should probably run all the options UI tests, but we don't need to run all the, sign up UI tests. And so we'll probably try to move to that model. And then maybe we'll even have one or two, like, a really, really small, like 4 or 5 sets of tests that we just say, like, we're just going to run these on, we'll make them our smoke tests and say, we'll just run these on every diff just to get like a super wide range of stuff. But those will be our most, wide covering and probably our most stable ones that, we're really, really confident that if these things fail in CI, someone actually broke something with the flows.
Yeah. So the benefit you've seen already is even with sort of probably running a bit of redundant tests every time as well.
Yeah.
That's great. It's great that you've already seen value even with that sort of future optimization still on the table. Cool. So I guess at this point, I'm curious how the local development experience is going. So what has changed there and how far have you gone in adopting, allowing local developers to make use of this fancy new tooling?
I think we still have a little ways to go with local development. I'm really happy that we started thinking about that probably about a month ago. So I think our last status update there was we basically can get Xcode all set up and completely from our build files. I think now we're really just on the how do we actually use Bazel underneath the hood, kind of working with Brentley a little bit on that. Or, this is something Brentley is like super experienced with. And he's kind of, I'd say he's trying to get that version of Rules Xcode project out now, where it actually starts building with Bazel. I think, we might have something we can really start playing around with next week or two. I think then it's probably just going to start thinking about, how do we start integrating this with developers? I think we're probably going to do a lot of opt-in stuff around this. I think one thing I just always try to do is just deliver value to people as fast as possible. And I think I would love to do something like, I don't know, set an environment variable in your computer and we'll start using Bazel as the build system for local development. But, here are all the warnings. But,
right.
Obviously my hunch with most of this stuff is we'll get to the world where it's working, 80% of the time perfectly. And, 20% of the time we'll have edge cases that we need to fix. But there's probably still a lot of value in developers using it that 80% of the time when they can. And then we just, always will have an escape hatch for as long as possible, or as long as we feel like we need to.
Yeah, I think you're definitely, as things continue to exponentially increase in time, like eventually, locally, you're going to have Bazel working effectively just to allow people to do their daily work, even in a focus mode project. So, yeah. So what are your thoughts around using full remote execution to build and test your app? So obviously in iOS with Bazel, this is one of the hardest features to unlock. When we're looking at pure Swift, it's a little bit easier, I think. I'm curious what your thoughts are there on how that can impact your project, if at all.
I think it's, kind of a whole new dynamic of problems that we need to start thinking about. Right now, we think so much about, how to best utilize the cores on your computer. I think once we start thinking about remote execution, it's going to be a lot more of how do we best rely on network throughput, really, at the end of the day. Like, there's just so much we have to be, remove the remote execution. There's obviously so much that's going back and forth over the network. I think the ideal world, obviously, it's that we're using remote execution for everything. At the end of the day, at some point, like if you edit a certain file, like it's going to take 10, 20 minutes to compile the app. Like there's just really, unfortunately, there's just literally nothing we can do about that. It's just the nature of the game. But there's obviously value in at least being like, make it while you're waiting for that, you can use Slack or Chrome. Right now, those are like really, I pretty much can't use either of those apps if I'm compiling the app on my computer. I'd say the long story short is, we're not even there to like start really evaluating that as an option. I think it's something that we're going to keep in the back of our minds. We definitely want to get local development working for developers, and we think we're in a really good place. It seems like the next logical step is to start at least exploring it and playing around with it. But I might have to get back to you on that one.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a fair item to keep pretty far out on the roadmap, especially in mobile. So yeah. And really, I think just getting to using Bazel and sharing that remote cache populated by CI for your developers, that will be really the majority of the speed up. So yeah, I think once you get there, that'll be really when you start to see those big impacts locally. Yeah, you're right. You're right that inevitably there's some big portion of the build graph will eventually have to get built. And that's where obviously the remote executors help. But for the most part, hopefully you're mostly incremental and the cache is enough there.
Yeah, I'm really excited for that. that first magical moment we're going to have when a new developer joins, they clone the repo and they just run a simple command and the app's built, because we'll have a full remote cache it. And, 1 minute later, they just have the app running in the simulator on their computer. I think that's going to be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, you're making good progress. So what's next on your roadmap? Curious, what are next steps for you at Robinhood?
Yeah, I think we're pretty much we're gonna, because Brentley is actually doing, so much work, really for us, some of the local building stuff. And, we think it's probably gonna be another week or two before we can have an MVP. So really next week or two, we're going to start doing super focused on getting CI over to Bazel. We think we're so close already. It seems like it's going to be an immediate value add to the team and, rapidly cutting down on people's CI time. So, I think we've kind of been heads down on this now for almost, maybe 2.5 months. So we think it'd be kind of nice to actually have a developer facing win and actually try to deliver that, especially because, I think the whole thing with local development is it's just so many more unknowns. So as much as we'd love to say developers can do local development in Bazel in a month, I can't promise that. So I'd love to get a quick win out to the team. And then I think the second that we get CI migrated, just full heads down straight to local development and whatever we can do to speed that up.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. I guess the one other big thing that is worth drilling in on, what were the gotchas that you hit along the way? What, if anything, was sort of an unknown that sort of popped out at you during this process? Because I think that this is definitely one of the areas that a lot of folks are hesitant about. Even if you get to a point where you've decided, okay, the wins might be worth the overhead of having to maintain build files and all this other stuff. In real world projects, of course, there's always unexpected occurrences that we just didn't plan for. So what, if any, of those sort of items jumped out at you while you worked on this?
Yeah, I mean, even I said a little bit earlier, just getting Objective-C libraries to work depending on Swift libraries and vice versa. There certainly were a little gotchas there, especially around figuring out how to kind of tweak the Objective-C build files with all the include paths. That was probably the first main gotcha. Some other things. Actually, one thing we wanted to do was basically have all this CI infrastructure around dealing with XE result bundles. And Bazel, I didn't realize, basically just kind of spits out this XML file, but it doesn't actually. They have this it's weird where they treat each target as a single test. So the XML file actually even the right structure of what you'd expect in XML, at least, for our assumptions of how we think about tests. So we did need to do a little tweaking to actually get Bazel tests to always output an XE result bundle. Because basically out of the box, the iOS rule set only will do XE result bundles if there's an app host, which, we don't want for most of our tests because that leads to its own set of issues with simulators. So we had to do a little tweaking there to get it. I think in the long run, we want to remove our dependency on XE result bundles so that we can rely on logic tests for as much as possible to speed things up. But it seems like, right now that we don't want to rewrite any, we're trying to limit the scope of the migration as much as possible. So getting XE result bundles simplifies a ton of other stuff for us. I'd say those were probably the first two. There's certainly always a lot of little things here and there, but, I think one of the things actually, maybe this is helpful to listeners is, I basically went into this with, let's just say, zero knowledge of Bazel. I'd even argue that today my knowledge of Bazel is still incredibly surface level, but I think something that has been just a huge sense of relief is one, the rule sets, whether it be Rules Swift, Rules Apple, or Rules iOS, they're super well featured, super well documented. They do really kind of just work out of the box. Maybe you have to do a little tweaking to your code base here and there, but, mostly it's been pretty smooth. And then even more importantly, I think just the community around iOS engineers or in the Bazel world these days, everyone's been super helpful. I think it's been this huge sense of relief that, really we're all doing the exact same, we kind of all have the same problem of we have these tool chains that we are 100% dependent on that aren't really built to handle the scale that we've all achieved. So, it is kind of this sense of shared problems and, everyone has been, anytime I have a question around I'm getting this issue and I'm not really sure where to go from here. People have been super helpful, whether it's, pointing to GitHub issues on the rule sets where someone else had brought this problem up or even just talking about, this is kind of how we dealt with this at, XYZ company. So it's been, I'd say there's been no gotcha that we haven't been able to figure out either by ourselves or with, the help of the community.
Well, that's amazing to hear. Yeah, we've come a long way. So that's awesome, man. Very cool. So I think we've pretty much covered everything. So Billy, thanks a lot for sharing this with us. And yeah, maybe we'll check back in at some point to hear how the remote builds are going.
Yeah. Thank you again so much for having me on. This is great.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to the Flare Build podcast. Please like, subscribe, and tune in again with Zach and Tatiana for the next podcast in the series.